My name is Susan Wehry. I'm really, really glad to be here with you. And I have to tell you, I was joking with my colleagues yesterday at the College of Medicine, and I said, we were updating one another and what we were doing this week. And I said, tomorrow I'm speaking to a group of really well-educated Maine older adults, and I'm supposed to tell them something about how to get through the winter. You guys are kind of expert on this theme. So I changed my title just ever so slightly. And Tom, if I may share it, I will share my screen. And I have retitled our conversation this morning, Taking Care of Ourselves and One Another During These Particular Winter Months. Because what a year it has been, what a year it was, what a year it is kicking off to be. And I thank you so much for being here to join this conversation, because one way that we do take care of ourselves and practice good self-care is to also take care of one another and to support one another through this really pretty extraordinary time, at least in my lifetime. And I'm referring, of course, to the fact that we have continued and at new levels, upheaval in our nation's capital and in our political dimension of our lives. And we've barely just gotten started. We also have, in what's depicted here in the right upper hand corner, we live in a world that has so much information that the World Health Organization is beginning to talk in terms of how do we stop the infodemic. And so we have a pandemic within a pandemic, and the infodemic refers to the fact that information, both accurate information, misinformation, and intentional disinformation is spreading at unprecedented speeds. So even if you try to live a life where there's a fair amount of reason, if you try to live an informed and educated life, it's a challenge to sort it all out. And so it's a set of challenges we haven't faced. We're indoors with it more, it being winter, and there's more of it. And so it actually provides us with a new opportunity and challenge for trying to sort it all out. And then, of course, as we're holding all of these distress signs on one hand of the equation, we have this new hope coming forward in the vaccine. And one thing I'd like to take advantage of today is to hear from you about your attitudes about the vaccine, what you're thinking about it, what you've heard about it, and so forth, if we have time, and add those in the chat box or maybe during our dialogue. So we live in interesting times, and we want to optimize our experience of that. So in the spirit of creating some virtual community in our E-Power series, I'd like you to type into the chat box for me one word that describes how you are right now, as if you were reporting the weather. Cloudy, clear skies, clear sailing, windy, sunny days ahead, whatever it is. And I'm just going to call my chat up here to see what the weather is in our room. Little worried, little hopeful. Tornado warning. I like that, Robin. I might use it. Hadn't thought of it, but it kind of cautious traveling. Cloudy, mixed. Cloudy but sunny days ahead. Hopeful, cloudy. Yeah, you see, we get it. We get it that these are turbulent times. They're unsettled times. And there's a mix of sun and cloud. There's a mix of sleet and rain. There's a little bit of snow for those of us who like it, and so forth. Fair to sunny. And there may be a storm always coming. We certainly have to stay tuned to that. So thanks for creating this sense of a mixed weather report. The bottom line in all of this, let's face it, is no one has been untouched by the events that have unfolded in the last year. And that has been true for us as a community, as a collective, and true for us at the individual level as well. And no matter how resilient, no matter how skilled you are at managing crises. This has been stressful. And when we look at stress, which we're going to in a little bit more, a little more detail, so to speak, in a moment, I'm really talking about an impact on the wholeness of our being, biologically, physically, spiritually, psychologically, socially. No dimension of our life has been undisturbed. And of course, with every turbulent system, with every rupture, with every disruption, there's an opportunity kind of for a resorting, and there is a desire to quell the turbulence. And so we have sometimes these competing interests. And I will say that it is the one thing our brains are not particularly well equipped to do. We don't like uncertainty. And so in some wisdom traditions, there is a notion of embracing uncertainty, but it's something you have to consciously work towards. The radical acceptance of not knowing, then acknowledging we never knew what the future held, but we live as if we do. And now we've had a kind of smack up the side of the head that says, no, you don't. Disrupted by many, many factors. And it's the thing we're not good at, but it's the thing we can get better at. That is to say, the tolerance of the not knowing. Typically, though, not knowing gives us a sense of helplessness, and we feel a loss of control. And so we try to get more and more things under our control, and some of them can be brought under control, and some can't. And so we have to try to figure out how we sort that difference. Whoops, sorry. I just went off my presentation for some reason. I stop my sharing for just a moment while I get it back. I clearly hit a wrong screen. I have two versions of this up here for some reason. Okay, now let me reshare. There we go. Okay, sorry about that disruption. What I wanted, the framework I wanted to give us this morning for our conversation in part is to really simply talk about how our brains work and why they're not working as well as we need them to work in these troubled times. So here's a little diagram of the brain. And I'm going to go to my next slide if I can figure out how to toggle back and forth here. Go to the next slide to point out three parts of the brain. Now, you don't have to remember these, but it's kind of fun to learn. That's one of the fun things to do indoors, right? And so here are three parts of the brain that I'm going to talk to you about because it's kind of fun to know. There is this part of the brain called the amygdala, roughly located here. The picture that you're seeing here is if your brain were outside and we cut it in half from what we call a sagittal view, the side view, and we were able to peek inside one half of it, we'd see this thing called the amygdala, shaped like an almond. That's how it gets its name. So the amygdala you've heard about because the amygdala is our fear center. It's what gets triggered. It's what sets us in motion for the fight or flight response to things. And the amygdala is a necessary part of our human survival. The problem is it's been overactivated in current times. And the effect of the amygdala and the purpose of the amygdala is actually to shut down this front part of the brain, grayed out here because it's not working, known as the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex You can learn that, or you can just say PFC. The prefrontal cortex is like our most evolved part of our brain. It houses our greatest human endowments. It houses our capacity for, or manages our capacity for empathy, for compassion, for wisdom, for judgment, for problem solving. Some people call it the CEO of the brain, but it is clearly the most highly evolved part of the brain. And when we need a more primitive response, the amygdala shuts it down. Shuts it down through a neurochemical process. We don't need to go into that, but it shuts it down quite literally. And I'll tell you how it works. And some of you may have heard this before. It's an analogy I often use. Imagine that you are driving down the road. Someone pulls out in front of you. You must take immediate action. You swerve, you brake, you ram full speed ahead. You do something, actually, to try to avoid that collision. You do that without thinking. You do that without forming a committee. You don't say, I wonder in this situation, would it make most sense to swerve, swear, slam on my brakes? Because by the time you think about it, you will be hit. You will have a collision. So the amygdala, in order for this whole thing to work well together, has got to turn off that thinking part. And whatever you were thinking about, it could be something happy, could be something sad, but it probably has nothing to do with driving, because most people are doing their to-do lists or thinking about any number of things. And so it shuts everything down until that danger is passed. Now, the problem in the past year is that it never felt like the danger had passed. And that's been true within the political discourse, that's been true within the pandemic discourse, that we are reminded constantly of a very real threat. We're reminded of it in a way that hasn't allowed us, I think, to turn on the best parts of our brain. So our fear center has been dominating, and this really does impair our top-down control of our decision-making. So many of you, no doubt, have felt after 10 months into this, a little more distracted, a little more forgetful perhaps, and maybe more reactive, maybe a little less willing to take other risks, more rigid, more concrete, all of those inflexible ways of being that come to the fore when we're afraid and come to the fore when we feel a need to kind of take control of everything. Many people have found themselves to be more emotional, more irritable, less patient. And what I hear people saying to me oftentimes in these months, and I would say for the last 4 months, actually probably even before the election, is I'm not myself. I don't recognize myself. This has changed me. And what I often say to people is, yes, you're experiencing some changes, but it hasn't changed you permanently if you can understand why this is happening, why you've become less patient, why you've become more rigid and so forth. But this is actually just a kind of simple, if you will, neurochemical response to a completely abnormal situation. And so the idea here is to say, well, if this way of thinking about it is accurate, is there anything we can do about it? And of course there is. Never describe a problem without a few solutions. So you might say to yourself just logically, like, okay, if this amygdala has been turned on for, some would say 4 years, some would say 1 year, take your pick, but it's on a lot, right? And so if something is overactivated, you want to deactivate it or tone it down a little bit. So first takeaway, how we take care of ourselves during these winter months in particular, is we want to start chilling our amygdalas. How do we do it? The first thing that we do is remove the exposure to the stressor that's causing the amygdala to stay on high alert. That means, in practical terms, if you watch any news media on television, say 5 hours a week, tune it down to 2.5 hours a week. If you're watching an hour a day, watch a half an hour. If you're not watching TV, but only listen to the radio, turn it off. If you're turning off your radio, read newsprint. One of the things about reading newsprint, even if you read it on a tablet, is that it is less activating of the amygdala. I don't care if you watch MSNBC or Fox News. Either channel you go to, and I would encourage you to check out whoever the other side is, check out their news. They shout constantly. They're hyper aroused. They use a lot of flash. They use a lot of pointing, and everything is pay attention to what I'm saying. And the part of your brain that helps you pay attention is the amygdala. When that pay attention part is tinged with a little fear, you better be worried. You better pay attention. Well, it's just like with the virus, right? You don't want to get COVID? Don't get near coronavirus. Decrease your exposure to the virus. How do we do that? We stay home. We wear masks. We wash our hands. We do things that we know will protect us from contact with the virus. Same thing, reduce your contact with the news. And if you're a political junkie, just go back to the old-fashioned reading the newspaper. It's not that I don't want you to have information. I don't want you to have the misinformation, the disinformation, or the emotionality surrounding most news media. Same message, same antidote if you happen to really like social media. Spend less time with your Facebook group. Spend less time doing the doom scroll on Twitter. Spend less time is one simple step anybody can take. And I guarantee you, you will feel better if you're feeling a little overactivated now. The second antidote that we know is really has a strong impact. And probably if there's one takeaway from our conversation, it's that we've got to figure out how to get physical exercise into our lives, even in winter. Now, the early messaging about stay home, I'm afraid, has people staying indoors. And after 10 months, what was necessary perhaps at 2 months. Staying home does not have to mean staying inside your house, never going out. It does mean, depending on where you live, taking the necessary precautions when you go out. In the winter months, of course, those precautions are going to include dressing warmly, not going out when it's icy, avoiding fall risk situations, and trying to figure out an exercise plan that will work for you. Exercise has and it's good for your heart, it's good for your brain, it's good for your bones. We know all of that. In this specific instance, what exercise does is to tone down the cortisol. And cortisol is that big stress hormone that is part of what's driving the negative impact of this adrenaline discharge. So physical exercise is really important. And I'm glad to say, for those of you who, and that would be all of you because you're here today, those of you who have a device for getting on the web, getting on the internet, you know that you can now go to virtual Tai Chi classes. You can take yoga classes. You can run in place with other people. You can do Zumba online. You can do whatever activity it is that is safe for you to do in your home. And so with that extra hour that you're saving from not watching the news, put it into your exercise plan. And really, those are the two things that are going to help you most. You can also deactivate the amygdala with deep breathing techniques. Most of you probably have heard something about these or may do them now, but it really is as simple as it sounds. Pause. Inhale deeply, letting your belly expand, and then exhale slowly. We breathe on average probably 12 to 15 times a minute. I want you to take it down to 4 and really do it deeply. That's deep breathing. You can do it throughout the rest of this talk if you like, and while we're gathered together today. Mindfulness practice as an intervention is a complex series of steps. You can take a 6 to 8 or 12-week course in it. It's a very useful practice. and is helpful for a lot of different behavioral and mental health concerns. What I'm talking about, though, is something as simple as this. Everything you do mindfully. When you take a sip of your coffee, when you brew your tea, when you brush your teeth, pay attention in the moment to what you're doing and make it a sensory experience. So I feel my hand on the handle of this coffee mug. My other hand is here. I feel the warmth of my coffee mug. I look at the contents. I note what they are. I take a sip. I note the temperature. It's a 30-second thing. And it says to my amygdala, she's got this. It says, nothing worrisome here. And everything we do is trying to get us not to just be chill all over, but to let our prefrontal cortex get back to work. That's what this is really, to my mind, all about. So tips for these winter months: don't watch so much news, get more exercise, breathe deeply, and pick up a little mindfulness practice that engages your senses and engages the present moment. That's really what it's about. Now, obviously, things like meditation, prayer, also can slow us down, but we're going to talk about those in a slightly different context momentarily. Right now, we want to get really concrete about getting your brains to work better for you. That's your winter month challenge. The other part of the brain we want to activate is this part called the ACC, or the anterior cingulate cortex, if you like words. Anterior cingulate cortex. It's the emotional regulation center of the brain, and it has been in these days a little on the underactivated side because of the prominence of this amygdala outpouring. So our first step is to chill the amygdala. Our second step is to get back in charge of our emotional regulation. And how do we do that? We do it quite simply by pausing, by not just being reactive, by acknowledging these extraordinary times. They are sad, they are tragic, they are frightening, they are worrisome, they are beautiful, they are magnificent, they are challenging, they are interesting, they are many, many, many things. And at any given time, we might have any emotional reaction to them. So name it. Name what you're doing, because when you put words to something, or if you're a visually expressive person, when you draw something to describe your emotional reaction, you're activating a part of the brain that's gotten a little on the sleepy side, I would say. The ACC is also activated when we practice gratitudes. And this is as simple as it sounds. Each day, name 3 things in the morning or before you go to bed for which you're grateful. You can continue to acknowledge all that is wrong, and there's a lot that needs fixing. But we also have to acknowledge all the things that we are grateful for. And for some of us, it might just be upright, breathing, and taking nourishment. This doesn't have to be materialistic. It doesn't have to be anything other than a momentary pause where you acknowledge, for the sake of your brain, that not everything is as bad as it sometimes seems. And then a lot of people find mantras very helpful. Mantras are things like can control what you can, let go of what you can't. I've got this, I can do this, I'm better than this, whatever it is. These kind of positive self-talk things that we say that are just simple reminders. And maybe if you're so inclined and you have a favorite mantra, toss it in the chat box for us. But mantras are really rote signals that you're feeling okay about something or that you're working something out. That's really what the use of a mantra is. And it uses this part of your brain, not your amygdala. Okay. The final part that I'm going to talk about here, the final part of the brain, is to talk with you about this prefrontal cortex. And here is where we really get to start feeling better again about how we're functioning. When we reboot the PFC, we've got it back online, start exercising it. And the way we exercise those best parts of our brain is to be part of solving problems, to be kind, to be compassionate, to look for opportunities to be kind, to practice kindness, okay? And to practice being flexibility. When two good ideas are on the table, let the other idea prevail. It's that kind of thing. And because I think we have a unique challenge around the whole problem with isolation, I'd ask for your help in continuing to think through how do we better support people who are living in long-term care. So we need to solve for isolation, both in the community and in the long-term care setting. And so I'd welcome hearing some good ideas about that. So here's your takeaway. You're going to chill the amygdala, exercise your anterior cingulate cortex, and reinstate the PFC. We need the best parts of ourselves and the best parts of our brain. Here's some things that will help you to actively replenish that which has been lost during these tumultuous times. As much time as you can spend in the natural world, do it. And you can do this virtually or in reality. There's a lot of good evidence coming out now that our brains simply work better on nature, as I like to say, or work better in nature, to the extent that you can go outside safely, spend time in the natural world, even when it's cold. We are Mainers, the better, okay? It's good for your brain. The second best thing is simply looking out a window. Looking out a window, looking up at the sky, looking at the distant horizon, naming what you see. That's also like a mindful moment. So you look at the sky and it automatically, this is the way we're wired, it opens your perspective. It opens your perceptions. It opens the psychological space. And when you can open your psychological space, you can open your hearts. So it's all very nicely wired together. And we just have to get it back online. We have to get it working better again. If you can't go outside for some reason that's not safe, if you can't look out the window or you don't have a window, the next best thing is to look at pictures of nature. Or if maybe you have plants or a fish tank or something in your house, but looking at pictures of nature actually is also really good for your brain. Now, I don't know any literature on virtual reality, but I'm thinking, Reggie, maybe that should be our next project. Is it better to use virtual reality of the natural world than just looking at pictures? I don't know. But the idea here is we need the natural world, and if we can't access it directly, we need to access it indirectly. Okay. And then you know the basics: sleep, exercise, eat well, stay well hydrated. And sleeping well does not mean taking sleeping pills. It means practicing good sleep hygiene. And that could be a conversation if anybody wants it. Secondly, replenish those stores that we've lost, and then name what you're going through. Acknowledge that this is scary. Acknowledge that you're fearful. Acknowledge the loss and the grief. And then the extra step for you is to name the specific impact it has had on you, on your family, on your friends. So oftentimes people will say, oh, I'm so afraid of what's going on in Washington. It really scares me. And the other person will say, me too. And they think that they've been talking about the same fear. But we don't know that without asking. And so I really encourage you, even when you're speaking with your like-minded friends or like-minded family, even when you're speaking with them, say, I feel afraid too. What are you afraid of? Can you name what that specific fear is? I know for a long time, since I, during these months in particular, live in a relative bubble. I mostly do hang out with people who have very similar views, have maybe dissimilar backgrounds, but we all arrive at some similar views. And so one of us will say, oh, I'm so scared, or I'm so mad, or I'm so sad. And we all say, yeah, yeah, yeah. And we assume that we're sad about the same thing. So I've gotten in the habit now, and I encourage you to do the same, of describing the specific impact. So we name it, describe it as specifically as we can, and understand it. We also need to actively frame this experience. For me, that's mostly about telling stories. I've recently encouraged my 97-year-old mother to do this. Please tell me everything, just sort of write down, how have you been dealing with COVID? And does it remind you of anything else? Some of her favorite stories, if you will, have to do with her experience in the Marine Corps. Some of her favorite stories about America as a country have to do with how we pulled together during Pearl Harbor. So she and I have some very different views at the moment in other spheres. And so in our effort to find our common experience, it's been around the pandemic. And so I've encouraged her to frame it by telling stories in a context that maybe makes it more familiar. And at the same time, reminding her and myself, not everything is about the pandemic. I think it's also that we elicit from one another specific concerns when people say, I'm worried, what are you worried about? Anything I can do to be helpful with that, and so on. And then one of the most empowering ways to frame this experience, I think, is to consciously make note of one positive thing you've learned about yourself during the pandemic. One positive thing you've learned about yourself that, pandemic or no pandemic, you're going to keep doing. One of the positive things you've learned about yourself in terms of tolerating differences, or one of the things you've learned about yourself about how hard it is to have civil discourse with people with whom you disagree. Whatever it is, extract the lessons of the moment, and it will engage your PFC. And then I would encourage all of us to remind our well-intentioned family, friends, neighbors who want to check on us to make sure how we're doing, that we appreciate that, but that we also ask how others are doing, and to let particularly our younger comrades, family, friends, whomever know that we've lived through maybe not anything like this, but we've lived through some tough times, and here's what we've learned about them. So ask for help when you need it, give advice when you can, keep a conversation going. Dialogue is really key here. Take advantage of some of this time to rekindle your creativity. Finally, I want to suggest that we all have an opportunity to actively think of ways to strengthen our community. And my hope is that we can move the conversation away from how do we make people do things, and how to understand why people don't want to do things. I just came off of a call talking about how are we going to get people to take vaccines or get vaccinated. And I think, one thing we could start with is a little more kind understanding of what people's fears might be and hear those out. So I want to move us away from coercion to kindness. I want to remind you that anxiety is super contagious, and there is a lot to be worried about. But calmness is also contagious, and we want to spread a little more calm and spread a little less anxiety. It's not that I turn a blind eye to all that is going on. It's that I actually keep a clear focus on what is going on without the anxiety, because the anxiety has our prefrontal cortex working less well. Our anxiety is what makes us rigid, risk aversive, non-compassionate. And so we want to spread the calm as much as we can, and not just the anxiety. We got to keep talking to one another. And now, during these winter months, talking to one another means on the phone, on Zoom, on Teams, on, I don't know what else, other ways, FaceTime, other ways to do it, on Google Meet. Everybody wants our video platform business. So let's give it to them. Let's have as much dialogue as we can. Conversation is absolutely crucial, and not to persuade one another of our points of view, but rather to hear from one another how we're doing during these particular times. With that, I'd like to thank you for participating. I'd like to thank you for being here, and to thank you for all that you're doing to make our shared world a better place.